Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 530. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone, today joined by co-host Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing?
Doing very well, Kyle. How are you?
Doing well. Happy to have you back on the show today. Here, Connor, we do have a lot of news to get through, so we'll be very quick on the plugs for today's show. If you're a new listener, subscribe somewhere. It's up anywhere you can listen to audio podcasts, YouTube, Rumble, Odysee for the video version, and then we post the show on the social media account at con_interest on X. And then you can follow me or friend me on Facebook if you want. And I also have an Instagram where I post everything. And then other than that, if you're a longtime listener, recommend the show, share it out there. Really appreciate when people do that. Connor, let's get into the news today. First up here, Senate votes down Bernie Sanders' resolution to probe Israel's slaughter in Gaza. The Senate on Tuesday night voted down a resolution by Senator Bernie Sanders that would have frozen U.S. military aid if the State Department failed to produce a report on whether Israel was committing human rights violations in Gaza. Under the resolution, which invokes the 1961 Foreign Relations Act, aid would have been frozen if human rights violations were found. The legislation failed on a vote of 72 to 11, with one Republican, Senator Rand Paul, and 9 Democrats and Sanders supporting the oversight of Israel's mass killings of Palestinians with U.S. weapons. Sanders wrote on X before the vote, "It should not be controversial to ask how U.S. weapons are being used. We should all want this information. If you believe the war has been indiscriminate, as I do, and apparently, I just add this one, Connor, as Joe Biden does, then we must ask this question. If you believe Israel has done nothing wrong, then this information should support that belief." And, that seems to be a pretty important point here, Connor, is that if Israel's not doing anything wrong here, then why do you care about having this investigation going forward? During a speech on the Senate floor last week, Sanders said that due to the scale of the destruction and extensive use of U.S. arms in this campaign, including thousands of massive 2,000-pound bombs, Congress must add to conduct real oversight. So, a little bit of good news that went forward in the Senate. The bad news is, of course, 90 senators don't agree. And one of them is Senator Butler. She's the new senator from California. I guess she was the appointment by Gavin Newsom after Dianne Feinstein passed away. So she gave an interview to the LA Times and was asked, "Why haven't you called for a ceasefire in Gaza? Do you think it's meaningful for a senator to call for a ceasefire or not?" And Connor, her response is quite astounding. "I don't want my voice to ever be utilized in a dehumanizing any California or American. We can both acknowledge that the atrocities of October 7th were horrible and Israel has a right to defend itself, while we honor the humanity of the innocent Palestinian lives that are being used as a political pawn by a terrorist organization, Hamas. And so for me, I want to use my time, energy, and attention to ensure that we are advocating for a permanent solution, and I don't want to continue the language that further divides our party, our community, or our country." And the LA Times followed up, "What language is dehumanizing language?" She answered, "To some, that is ceasefire language, and to some is other words and phrases that have been sort of utilized in this context. To me, I want to focus on what is the solution, what we can implement now and in the future to accomplish both goals." And so, first of all, Connor, most of this is just word salad. She doesn't have a whole lot to say, but she actually does clarify and say here that she believes that calling for a ceasefire is dehumanizing language, and that somehow this is how I want to get this right, honor the humanity of the innocent Palestinian lives. Absolutely unbelievable that senator said this. Is just disgusting. All
Yeah.
right.
Hey, Kyle, did you see who the other Democratic senators were that supported Bernie's resolution? Because I got to admit, that was pretty commendable of him to do, because he's been pretty weak on this. In fact, earlier on, the Israel lobby was sort of propping up Bernie as a way to sheepdog his progressive colleagues, so to speak, with his rhetoric about how I don't see how you can have a ceasefire with a group like Hamas. But so for him to do this, I mean, it's pretty late in the game, with almost 25,000 people dead already, mostly women and children. But it's still good to see him doing this. And so I'm wondering who the other Democrats were. And also, I'd like to give kudos to Rand Paul because he again, that's also very important, I think, to have a Republican senator supporting this resolution.
Yeah, I do agree on the Rand Paul thing. I do not have that list I could get for Monday show or something. Next up here, Connor, Israel can now detain Palestinians without a lawyer for half a year. This is a report in Haaretz. The Israeli Knesset approved on Monday the second and third readings of an extension of the emergency regulations that have allowed Israeli authorities to deny security prisoners detained since October 7th the option to meet with their lawyers. The regulations will be valid for an additional 3 months and will allow the state to prevent prisoners from meeting with a lawyer for up to 180 days. And Connor, the problem here is a lot of these people are just kind of disappeared. Their families don't really know where they are. Without access to a lawyer, there's really no way for them to communicate. And this is a number I got from France 24, and they, talked to some human rights organizations in Israel, and they came up with there's over now 3,000 detained Palestinians without charge or trial. And so these are people put into the administrative detention protocols, which it seems like that's probably what that 180-day extension people fall into. I'm not sure if when they're counting this number at 3,300 Palestinians that are in administrative detention, if they count those Palestinians in Gaza who've been rounded up and put into camps, my guess is no, based on the number of Palestinians that have been arrested in the West Bank, but I'm not sure about that. So that number has expanded from 1,200 before October 7th to now 3,300. And of course, they could be detained for quite a long time without charge or lawyer in that state. Now, next up here, report Netanyahu says Israel's campaign in Gaza could continue through 2025. This is from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. The report from Israel's Channel 12 said Netanyahu made the comments during a meeting with local council chiefs from kibbutzim and other communities near the Gaza border. Netanyahu told them that Israel's current assessment is that operations in Gaza will continue into the next year. Before the new year, an Israeli military spokesperson said Israeli forces would be fighting in Gaza for the entire year of 2024. The Israeli slaughter in Gaza has already killed over 24,000 Palestinians, and more than 60,000 have been wounded in just over 3 months. Many more are expected to die due to starvation and disease caused by the brutal siege, unless there is immediate ceasefire and major humanitarian relief effort. Martin Griffiths, the UN relief chief, told CNN this week that the great majority of 400,000 Palestinians in Gaza who the UN determined are at risk of starving are actually in famine, not just at risk of famine. Netanyahu has the incentive to continue the onslaught in Gaza for as long as possible, as his political career is in peril. Also his freedom, as there are substantial corruption charges against Netanyahu that could, embroil him in a court case and potentially a jail sentence if he is no longer prime minister. Polling in Israel has shown that Israelis want him to step down after the war. Some U.S. officials are worried that Netanyahu might see provoking a major war in Lebanon as the key to his political survival. All right, so next up here is a report from NBC News, and they say 3 senior U.S. officials say the Biden administration is looking past Netanyahu to try to achieve its goals in the region. Several senior U.S. officials told NBC News that Netanyahu will not be there forever. The official said that the Biden administration is trying to lay the groundwork with other Israeli and civil society leaders in anticipation of an eventual post-Netanyahu government. In an attempt to work around Netanyahu, Blinken also met individually with members of his work cabinet and other Israeli leaders, including the leader of the opposition and former Prime Minister Yair Lapid, officials said. Netanyahu's polling numbers in Israel are abysmal, and he is in the middle of a trial over corruption charges. Tel Aviv has rebuffed several of Washington's requests over the past month, even as the U.S. ships weapons to Israel nearly every day. NBC News reports that Blinken told Netanyahu that ultimately there is no military solution to Hamas, according to the officials, and that the Israeli leader needs to recognize that or history will repeat itself and violence will continue, but the official said that Netanyahu was unmoved. And Connor, we also got reports out today that apparently Netanyahu told Blinken while he was in Israel that there will not be a two-state solution, that there will never be a Palestinian state. And and I believe he's just said this publicly, that there will be one state from the river to the sea. And of course, he means an Israeli state, not a Palestinian one. So Connor, it's very confusing how that rhetoric could be genocidal when the Palestinians are asking for their freedoms, but when Netanyahu says it and is trying to force, millions of Palestinians off of their land in Gaza currently, that's somehow not problematic. Very concerning how that happens. Now, I really think the problem with this policy, Connor, is Netanyahu is going to outlast President Joe Biden here, and the incoming administration has been, or whoever it is, whether it's Nikki Haley, Donald Trump, Ron DeSantis, RFK Jr., have all pledged to support Israel, and their main criticism of Joe Biden seems to be not enough support for Israel. And so by the time we get to the election, they could all be doubled down on. We have to triple down on. We have to give even more and more and more support to Israel, not less. So this is really concerning. Next up here, Israeli forces attacking near largest remaining hospital in Gaza and cause major damage to second facility. Reuters reports Israeli forces fighting to seize the southern Gaza Strip's main city, pounded the areas near the biggest hospital still functioning in the enclave on Thursday, sending patients and residents fleeing a battle they feared would lay the city to waste. Medical Sans Frontières, which is Doctors Without Borders, posted on X, according to MSF surgeon in Nasser Hospital last night's Israeli forces heavily bombed the area close to the hospital with no prior evacuation order, causing patients and many of the thousands of displaced civilians who have sought refuge in Nasser to flee in panic. The Jordanian army also reported that Israeli forces had badly damaged a nearby field hospital. Jordan said the attack was a violation of international law. So this I thought was really interesting, Connor. It's in the Wall Street Journal, and it said rifts among Israel's war cabinet are spilling into public view, threatening to undermine the country's military strategy in Gaza at a crucial stage in the conflict. The small collection of wartime decision makers, Prime Minister Netanyahu, Defense Minister Gallant, and former head of the Israeli military Benny Gantz, is divergent publicly on two of the biggest dilemmas they face: whether Israel should negotiate to end the conflict and free the hostage, and who should govern the bombed out strip once this war is over. Under pressure from families of hostages held by Hamas and other militants in Gaza, Gantz, the head of the National Unity Party, and his deputy are pushing to enter talks with Hamas to bring home the roughly 130 captives still in the enclave, according to Israeli media reports widely discussed among party analysts. Netanyahu and Gallant, both in the ruling Likud party, meanwhile say maintaining military pressure on Hamas will force the group to make concessions. Now, I want to highlight this, Karen, because I think this is so important. It's essentially that acknowledging that all the captives could be released if they ended the military campaign, that this is a deal that they are just actively choosing not to accept. And so, I think that's an absolutely huge omission that kind of gets buried in this story here. Another really important point, Connor, is that Israel keeps saying, well, we have to carry out this military campaign to free our hostages. Well, so far, the Israeli military campaign has freed exactly 0 hostages. Hostages agreement have led to, I believe, over 100 hostages being freed, and the Israeli military has only managed to kill hostages, at least 3, and those were essentially murdered in cold blood. They were, men standing outside without their shirts on, waving white flags, that were, murdered with bullets fired by a sniper and then one army infantry personnel. So, just to finish up with this Wall Street Journal article here on the other issue, while the Prime Minister and his Defense Minister are in agreement about continuing the war, they're increasingly at odds over who should govern Gaza after it. A question becoming more urgent as Israel seems to move to lower intensity phase of its war and seeks to prevent a vacuum emerging in the enclave. Gallant said on Monday, that's the defense minister, the most intensive phase of the fighting is complete in northern Gaza, adding that the Israeli military is close to completing the intense fighting in south around the city of Khan Yunis. It isn't clear that the entire Israeli security establishment agrees with that assessment. When asked later on Monday about Gallant's comments, the Israeli military spokesperson pushed back, saying that the fighting in the south will take time. The military have more work to do, both above ground and below ground, in the vast tunnel network built by Hamas. And of course, Connor, the U.S. is in disagreement on pretty much all of this with their American backers. It's just that the U.S. won't leverage anything to push Israel here. This is from Business Insider, and I think it's just kind of an important thing to note. The Bank of Israel's governor, Amir Yaron, told Bloomberg TV, the war is costing us directly, and this is give or take about 10% of GDP and another 2% in lost revenues. I call that a temporary hump of the war. So, this is costing Israel money, although this is probably an indication of why they're so interested in getting billions of dollars in military aid from the U.S. This is from Jason Didds, January 17th at antiwar.com. Israel pounds southern Lebanon with airstrikes and artillery fire. And so this is just, really documenting the further escalation of the conflict in Lebanon. And then this from Jason Didds today at antiwar.com. Israeli military chief says Lebanon war likely in coming months. Visiting troops near the northern border, the head of Israel's military, Lieutenant General Halvi, discussed the potential war of Lebanon, saying the likelihood of a conflict in the coming months is much higher than it had been. The general said he believes Israel will be starting the war with more advantage than in the past, and that the lessons learned in Gaza will be applied to the situation in Lebanon. Tens of thousands of troops are reportedly being readied for the new offensive. The comments echoed those of Major General Gordon, the head of the Northern Force, who said earlier this week that he believes the troops are ready for the war in Lebanon that could start tonight if necessary. And Connor, we shouldn't also forget that U.S. officials have warned, even gone as far as speaking with the Huffington Post, that Biden is just completely so dedicated to Israel that there's nothing they could do to rein him in. So I'm going to hand it over to Connor here for a few minutes. He's got a couple stories on the West Bank, and then I will get into some more news about the war in Yemen. So Connor, what you got for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and the other more disturbing part of that article was when they said that Gantz, Gallant, and Netanyahu were all hell-bent on that war with Lebanon, and I guess the American people are just along for the ride, regardless, like you said, of who takes the White House after Biden croaks or loses this election. So, all right. Now, this is we're going to catch up on some of the violence going on in the West Bank. So this is from Al Jazeera from the 15th. Israeli forces killed 3 Palestinians in the West Bank over the weekend. So, or just on Monday, actually. So at least 3 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli forces in the occupied West Bank. According to the Palestinian Ministry of Health, 2 Palestinians were shot on Monday during confrontations with the Israeli military in the town of Dura near Hebron in the southern West Bank. This is from the Palestinian news agency Wafa. Mohammed Hassan Abu Sabah, who's 22, was killed after he was shot in the heart by Israeli forces. Ahed Mahmoud Mohammed, who was 23, died after he was shot in the head. The director of the Dura Governmental Hospital told Wafa. Now, 10 other people were transported to the hospital with gunshot wounds. The Israeli military said that its forces opened fire at a group of about 100 Palestinians taking part in a protest during which bricks and firebombs were thrown at soldiers. Since the 7th, the IDF and settlers have been shooting Palestinians at protests against the war in Gaza. And so The military said the man who was shot had thrown a firebomb, but it did not provide evidence for the allegation. In a separate incident, Fares Khalifa, who was 37 years old, was fatally shot by Israeli forces near Tulkarem in the northern West Bank, according to the health ministry. So since the war began, the West Bank has experienced surging violence and attacks by Israeli forces, not seen since the Second Intifada from 2000 to 2005. According to the UN office, and if it's anything like that, we're going to see thousands of Palestinian casualties before this, just in the West Bank. We're getting, I mean, it's up to, the death toll is over 360 right now, with almost 100 children in the West Bank since the 7th. According to the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, Israeli forces have killed 30 Palestinians, including 7 children in the West Bank, just in the first 15 days of this year. Last year, 507 Palestinians were killed, the highest annual death toll since OSHA started recording the casualties in 2005. Separately, Israel arrested students at a university in the occupied West Bank during an early morning raid. The students attend the Al-Najah National University in Nablus, which called for their immediate release, describing the army raid as blatant Israeli aggression. The university and the Palestinian Prisoners Club, an advocacy group, said that 25 students were arrested in the raid. The Israeli army said security forces arrested 9 wanted persons associated with a Hamas student cell. Now, this next story is from Middle East Eye. Israeli forces kill 9 Palestinians in West Bank strikes. This is from the 17th. Israeli forces killed 9 Palestinians in drone strikes in the occupied West Bank. This is Wednesday morning this week as the military carried out a raid in the city of Tulkarem. The airstrike in the refugee camp in Tulkarem, which comes amid an ongoing military raid on the city, killed 4 Palestinians in the Al Tamam neighborhood, the Palestinian Health Ministry said. The Israeli military prevented ambulances from entering the camp. This is typical of the IDF. According to the Palestine Red Crescent Society, Palestine Red Crescent teams couldn't transport 4 martyrs from inside the Tulkarem camp due to the occupation's bombardment, the group said in a statement. The attack took place hours after another air attack killed 5 people near the Balata refugee camp in Nablus. A large contingent of Israeli forces stormed the city and the camp of Tulkarem at dawn on Wednesday. Military vehicles, tanks, and bulldozers attacked on 3 fronts, leading to violent confrontations in the camp. The military surrounded the camp, blocked all entrances, deployed snipers in buildings at the main entrance, as well as in adjacent and surrounding buildings. Earlier, an Israeli drone targeted a car driving east of Nablus near Balata camp, killing 5 Palestinians, according to the health ministry. So since the start of the war on the 7th, they're saying that it's gone up since then, but 360 people have been killed, with 41 Palestinians killed this month alone. So it remains the whole status quo of open season on Palestinians as far as the Israeli forces and the settlers are concerned continues. And it is now a regular occurrence that we see these airstrikes in West Bank refugee camps and villages, and these massive raids. Whereas just last year, when we were covering the raid in Jenin last summer, it was it was a huge deal that Israel had carried out a drone strike on the refugee camp in Jenin, because we hadn't seen anything like that in 15 years. And the brutality of sending in all these bulldozers to tear up roads and water lines and electricity, and sending in all these armored vehicles and Apache helicopters. And now we see that on a regular basis. And so it's only going to get worse from here. And as we covered the other week, UNICEF is already saying it's the deadliest year on record for children in the West Bank. And I believe we're already beyond the record of last year, which was already one of the deadliest years for Palestinians. We had 507 people killed. It looks like it's going to be even worse in 2024.
All right, Connor. Some news on Yemen here. The first article I have is U.S. and U.K. airstrikes force aid groups to suspend operations in Yemen. So the U.S. and U.K. airstrikes in Yemen have forced some aid groups to suspend operations in the country, and they are warning against further escalation in the region. Before Israel unleashes campaign in Gaza, the UN considered the situation in Yemen to be the world's worst humanitarian crisis. The U.S. and Saudi Arabia and the UAE led war against the Houthis. That was from 2015 until 2022. The coalition enforced a blockade on the Houthi-controlled areas of Yemen, where about 70 to 80% of Yemenis live, and 377,000 people, at the very least, were killed in that war. About 60% of those who died due to starvation. That was caused by the siege. Yemenis have held a ceasefire since April of 2022 with the Saudis, and so that has held relatively well. The blockade has been eased, but it does still remain to some extent, and of course the Yemenis are still essentially in a wartime economy where most of the population still relies on aid. The statement from 26 aid groups said nearly 9 years of war has left more than 21 million people, over 2/3 of the population, in desperate need of food, water, and life-saving assistance. Millions of Yemenis face widespread displacement, food insecurity, and limited access to basic services. The statement said that after the U.S. and British airstrikes, some humanitarian organizations have been forced to suspend operations over safety and security concerns, while other assets assess their ability to operate. The U.S. launched a third, now fourth and fifth round of strikes so far. So let's get into the a little bit more recent updates here. The Houthis say the U.S. placed a terrorist label on the Houthis, and the Houthis say it will not impact their decision to stand with the Palestinian people to stop the massacres in Gaza, just as America does in its support of Israel to continue the massacres. And Dave explains here in his article that they listed the Houthis as a specially designated global terrorist, and the president, and so the Biden administration on Wednesday announced that it was redesignating the Houthis as specially designated global terrorists, a move that could complicate aid deliveries in Yemen and make peace between the Saudis and Houthis more difficult. President Biden lifted the designation on the Houthis in February of 2021 as a foreign terrorist organization designation, which was implemented by the Trump administration. Both designations come with economic sanctions, but the foreign terrorist organization is considered more harsh and would essentially criminalize delivering aid to Houthi-controlled areas of Yemen. So this seems to be the first and maybe the more minor step here, Connor, on the sanctions. But as we've seen in the past, once you start to sanction countries, nobody wants to do business with them. It's not going to be worth it for shipping companies or whoever to risk running afoul of U.S. sanctions here to deliver aid to Yemen. So I'm sure this will hurt, but it's not as significant as the FTO designation that was put in place at the end of the Trump administration, which Biden lifted. So we had the fourth round of U.S. strikes against Yemen. This was on Friday, or these strikes I think were on Wednesday, and then we had the fifth round of strikes on Thursday. So the U.S. just keeps attacking Yemen again and again. Now the Houthis are striking back. This isn't stopping them from carrying out their attacks. The Houthis have attacked another U.S.-owned ship in the Gulf of Aden. The Houthi military spokesperson said the Houthi forces targeted the Genco Picardy, a bulk carrier owned by the New York City-based Genco Ship Management, according to the ship ownership data. The attack said it resulted in direct hits on the ships. Officials told the Associated Press that the vessel was struck about 70 miles southeast of Aden and was also hit with a bomb-carrying drone. And so it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of damage being done by these Houthi attacks, Connor, but it's very interesting that it's after the U.S., carries out fourth, fifth round of attacks that suddenly the Houthis are hitting actually U.S. ships. Now, this is maybe the craziest thing I have to say today, Connor. And of course it is, because I'm quoting Joe Biden. But this is a wild omission. So today, was it January 18th, Joe Biden was asked about the bombing in Yemen, and he was asked if it was working. And the president said, and I quote, when you say working, are they stopping the Houthis? No. Are they going to continue? Yes. And so Biden is admitting what we've been saying on this show all along, Connor. The strikes on Yemen are not going to work. They're not going to stop the Houthis, but once the US starts, now they're stuck in this policy where either they're going to bat down to the Houthis and the Houthis are going to win another war against the American empire, or the Biden administration is just going to keep bombing Yemen even though it's not having a great impact. All right, Connor. And by the way, this is the CENTCOM announcement of the fifth round of strikes that they say happened on January 18th. I think you got a couple more articles for us here, so I'll hand it back over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So this story kind of dovetails with Yemen in a sense, because we're talking about Saudi Arabia, and instead of here you have a war that's killed 400,000 people at least. The UN says, since 2021, at least the latest estimate being that 377,000 people have died. The vast majority of those died due to deprivation and disease as a result of the blockade and the ruthless bombing of every kind of civilian infrastructure and farmland you can think of. And most of those victims are infants and children under 5 years old. So we have an opportunity to stop that war and to forge at least something approximating a permanent peace between the Houthis and the Saudis, if we can only just stay out of the way. And so Biden, of course, is, as you say, putting himself into this position where you have to constantly go up this escalation ladder with the Houthis every time they attack either an Israeli-linked or U.S.-linked ship. And we're just going to be stuck in another endless war here in Yemen. It could jeopardize the peace deal with the Saudis with these new sanctions. Now, what Blinken is trying to do is get Saudi Arabia to normalize relations with Israel, because as we've discussed going back before the 7th, well before the 7th, the Biden administration sees this for some reason as being, if they could accomplish this, then they would go into, the Diplomacy Hall of Fame or something, because of all the horrible wars Israel and Saudi Arabia have fought throughout history and even recently, against each other. And so anyway, so in the midst of committing genocide, it looks like Blinken went down there and was trying to help and find a way that he could get Netanyahu on board for this deal with Saudi Arabia. So this piece is from the Cradle. It's Netanyahu rebuffs Saudi normalization offer. And so this is based off of that piece in NBC that Kyle was talking about earlier. So Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has rejected an offer from Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, to normalize ties with the kingdom. NBC cited U.S. officials as saying yesterday, with the 17th. So, quote, the Saudi Crown Prince offered to normalize relations with Israel as part of a Gaza reconstruction agreement, a diplomatic development Netanyahu has long sought, but only if the Israeli leader agrees to provide Palestinians with a pathway to statehood, the U.S. officials told NBC. And I think Blinken felt like if he could get Netanyahu to just agree, in quotes, in principle, to a two-state solution, that they might be able to get somewhere. But, of course, Netanyahu cannot do that even at this point. I mean, even with a wink and a nod, I don't think it's politically tenable in Israel, because Netanyahu may be very unpopular. I mean, 85% of the country, according to the latest polls, want him to leave office after the war is over. So he's got in addition to the corruption trials he's facing, he's got to keep that war going as long as possible. And, the thing is, he's very unpopular, but the war is extremely popular. It has almost unanimous support from the Israeli public. And so, this idea of any new blood coming in, whether it's Lapid or Gantz or whoever, or Gallant even, I don't know that this stipulation the Saudis are putting out there about a pathway to statehood can be, taken up in any real substantive way. So this might become totally dead on arrival anyway, as it has been, or at least as I thought it was the last couple of months. So the Saudi offer was proposed during Blinken's trip to Saudi last week. And this comes as part of his regional tour, which later included stops in Israel as well as the occupied West Bank. So Netanyahu rejected the offer, the officials added, telling Blinken that he's not prepared to make a deal that allows for a Palestinian state. So the NBC report highlights Washington Washington is growing increasingly frustrated with Netanyahu's handling of the war, as well as his refusal to consider U.S. proposed plans for what comes after. So Netanyahu and Biden are reportedly no longer on speaking terms, and they're referring here to that piece from Axios that discusses how Netanyahu, I guess the last phone call that they held, according to the sources, was on the 23rd of December. Netanyahu refused a request to transfer the tax revenues that are being withheld by the Israelis from the Palestinian Authority. And in response, Biden said, "This conversation is over," and hung up the phone. The NBC report adds that Blinken told Netanyahu there was no military solution to deal with Hamas. According to the officials, however, Netanyahu was said to be unmoved. According to the three officials, the Biden administration is looking to sidestep Netanyahu and looks towards other Israeli leaders for a solution. Netanyahu, quote, "will not be there forever," the officials went on to say. And during the visit, Blinken met, of course, with other members of the war cabinet, including Yair Lapid, the former prime minister. So the officials who spoke with NBC said Blinken deliberately began his regional tour by visiting Arab states first instead of Israel in order to, quote, "bring Netanyahu a unified Arab post-war proposal." Qatari Prime Minister Mohammed bin Abdul Rahman Al Thani on January 16th at the World Economic Forum in Davos remarked that Israel has rejected every proposal put forward by the Arab states for an end to the war in Gaza. He said the Arabs proposed several solutions and initiatives regarding Gaza, but the Israelis rejected them all. Saudi officials recently confirmed as well that normalization between Israel and the kingdom is still on the table. However, a deal would have to include an end to the war, a Saudi-funded reconstruction of Gaza, a reformed Palestinian Authority-led government, which is also the goal of the United States, at least on paper, and to assume that they want, supposedly like a revitalized PA to take over Gaza, and a path forward for Palestinian statehood, all of which have been shut down by the current Israeli regime. And it is pretty phenomenal to see this. I mean, just what the Biden administration has been willing to put on the table in order to secure this deal between Israel and the Saudis. I mean, assistance in building their nuclear energy program, a mutual defense commitment, as well as increased access to advanced American weapons. Now, all that energy should have been put into ensuring that there was a real lasting settlement to the war in Yemen between the Houthis and the Saudis. But of course, our priorities, at least especially with this Israel First administration that's in power right now, and I don't think would be any different with Trump, or whoever is more, is likely to take office besides him. It's really just so disappointing to see how the priorities of what Israel wants and how can we please Tel Aviv and accomplish their goals in the region seems to take precedent over virtually every other interest. And that's how we get into situations like this, where we're looking at an endless war in Yemen. It's just on top of everything else, this genocide that we were a party to, starving, at least at this point, let alone the whole population of Gaza. But certainly we have somewhere approaching 400,000 to 500,000 people living in famine conditions right now. So it's just absolutely disgraceful. There's really no words that are strong enough. Okay, so now this next piece. And this just gets more a bit to the Houthis and this accusation that we're hearing over and over again from Lindsey Graham and other hawks. But I guess it's becoming conventional wisdom because so much of the media, they're completely out to lunch and don't know much about. Well, if anything, I've actually seen segments on television news where they report on, well, who are the Houthis anyway? And they get basically to where they take over with Saleh. They take power in Sana'a at the end of 2014. And then they skip a few things, and now they're attacking our ships because they're aligned with Iran, and that's just what terrorists do. And Iran is the leading state sponsor of terror. They literally will skip over the entire war from March of 2015 until the ceasefire in April of 2022. They will skip over the entire. I've seen this it was Fox Business, in fact, and so now this is interesting because this is from U.S. intelligence. Officials and sources speaking to the Times. Huge article in the Times. David Sanger, I think, has the first byline of all people. But this is they're saying that Iran is not dictating the Houthis' actions. Okay, so and this article's from the Cradle where they're summarizing it. But U.S. intel agencies have determined that Ansarallah, the Houthis, is a quote independent movement, does not take orders from Iran. And this is again the Times citing officials as saying in a report on January 14th. So U.S. officials said Friday, according to the New York Times, quote, American spy agencies believe that the Houthis are an independent organization and Iran is not dictating their day-to-day operations. There is no direct evidence that senior Iranian leaders, either the commander of the elite Quds Force or the supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, ordered the recent Houthi attacks on ships in the Red Sea, the report adds. The White House does claim, however, to have evidence that Tehran is providing weapons to the Ansarallah resistance movement, which is militarily aligned with the armed forces of Yemen's Sana'a government. That evidence is never particularly compelling, especially early on in the war. Gareth Porter did some great work debunking a lot of these claims, the great investigative reporter. Now, I think it's likely that, as Nasser Arabi was saying years ago, that, well, what do they think? We don't have email? Meaning that you can get the Houthis can get intelligence assistance or just, assistance in building their drone systems and their missile systems by talking to Iranian military experts. It doesn't mean that they're being armed by Iran. And how are they going to get through the U.S. Navy and Saudi naval blockade in the first place that was starving hundreds of thousands of children to death? This is it was always kind of absurd to suggest that Iran was arming the Houthis the whole time. Yemen is flush with weapons from the old Soviet Union, the American government. I mean, we were arming Saleh and his successor, Mansour Hadi, these U.S.-backed and Saudi-backed puppets for the longest time, in arming them to the teeth, and they were using them to go to war with the Houthis, and they kept losing. There's no shortage of weapons for the Houthis to be using right now for all these different operations against American and Israeli shipping alone, let alone, if it does start up again, to go back to hitting Iran, Saudi oil facilities and other key targets like that. But they claim they have evidence. Now, despite the fact for 9 years, Yemen has been under this tight blockade, as I said, by a U.S.-backed Arab coalition headed by Riyadh, as well as the fact that its main port and airport remain besieged. And of course, now the U.S. is bombing the airport and Hodeidah, the main port for North Yemen, where the Houthis hold power. And that's where 70 to 80% of the population lives. So the Houthis appear able to make many of their own weapons, including drones assembled from parts obtained from China and other suppliers, the report goes on to say. Now, the Sana'a government is also in possession of a significant amount of Soviet-era weapons. Western media has long labeled Ansarallah an Iranian proxy that receives directives from the Islamic Republic. Western media push similar ideas about Hezbollah and the Iraqi resistance. In response to such claims, for what it's worth, Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah said in a speech on January 3rd that in the axis of resistance, no party dictates to another, and each individual party makes its decisions in a manner consistent with the strategic vision and interest of its country. There are no slaves in the axis. There are only proud free men who create victories for their people, Nasrallah added. Washington recently carried out a series of violent attacks on several provinces in Yemen in response to Ansarallah's maritime blockade on Israeli shipping in the Red Sea. The Houthis and Sana'a's armed forces, however, have vowed to continue their operations, of course, declaring that they will not back down in the face of American military power. And so it's important to get that out there, that American officials are admitting that this rhetoric we're hearing from all of our representatives in Congress and in the Senate, virtually, this argument that the Houthis are Iranian cat's paws, is just simply not true. And that you can't just wish away American culpability and responsibility for this international crisis or the war on Gaza by just, crying about Iran and spouting off slogans that are in next to the bullet points in their little sheet that they get from whatever think tank is sending them the talking points that week. So anyway, it's I'm glad to see that at least they're admitting that. So okay, so now this next story, this is from Dave DeCamp on January 17th. This is about what's going on with Iraq and Pakistan, because Iran has conducted some missile strikes in both countries recently, as well as Syria, in response to the attack on the memorial service that killed almost 100 people for General Qasem Soleimani, who Donald Trump assassinated illegally in Baghdad 4 years ago. Recently here, just on January 3rd, and then also they were responding to, they fired some missiles into Syria at some Al Qaeda targets, and also at what was claimed to be a Mossad base in Erbil in Iraqi Kurdistan, similar to some actions that they did in March of 2022 after a significant drone attack that was carried out in Iran, which recently a former Israeli Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, actually took credit for in the Wall Street Journal. So anyway, it's not Baghdad and Islamabad are not happy about all this. So Dave writes that Iraq and Pakistan are both protesting these Iranian missile strikes that targeted their territory in recent days, as Tehran is defending its attacks. Iran said that the strikes it launched in Pakistan targeted Jaish al-Adl, a Sunni Muslim militant group that operates across the Iran-Pakistan border and has a history of conducting terrorist attacks in Iran. Most recently, the group took responsibility for a December 15th attack on a police station in Iran's southeastern city of Rask that killed 11. So Islamabad strongly condemned the Iranian strikes in Pakistan and said that 2 children were killed. So the Foreign Ministry of Pakistan said that we strongly condemn the unprovoked violation of our airspace by Iran, which resulted in the death of 2 innocent children while injuring 3 girls. This violation of Pakistan's sovereignty is completely unacceptable and can have serious consequences, the ministry added. Pakistan, of course, a nuclear-armed state, also recalled its ambassador to Iran as a result of these strikes. So Hossein Amir Abdollahian, Iran's foreign minister, defended the strikes on Wednesday, speaking at in Davos at the World Economic Forum, and he said, "None of the nationals of the friendly and brotherly country of Pakistan were targeted by Iranian missiles and drones. The so-called Jaish al-Adl group which is an Iranian terrorist group that was targeted." So now Iran has said that its strikes in Iraq that were launched on Monday targeted again, as I said, this Mossad base they claim that is over there in Erbil, part of the northern Kurdistan region, likely in retaliation for Israel killing a senior Iranian military officer in Syria. Iran's top commander was killed in a neighborhood outside of Damascus, I believe on the 26th of December. And, he was in charge of facilitating arms transfers to Hezbollah by way of Syria from Iran. And so it was at that time, along with some of the other high-profile assassinations that Israel was carrying out in Lebanon of Hezbollah officers, but also Hamas officials, it looked like they were getting ready to expand the war much more immediately. But it looks like it hasn't happened just yet in terms of the real clash and spilling over of the war there between Lebanon and Israel. But so in response to that, or potentially in response to that, that's why we've seen these ballistic missile strikes onto this, what they're saying is a Mossad facility. And so importantly, Dave writes, Israel is known to have intelligence operatives and assets in the area. U.S. officials have acknowledged that Iran did, in fact, strike a Mossad facility the last time they claimed to in those strikes of March of 2022. But both the Baghdad-based government and the local Kurdish government said that the Monday attack killed civilians. So Iraqi Prime Minister Mohammed Shia al-Sudani said the Iranian strikes were, quote, clear aggression against Iraq. According to the Cradle, al-Sudani and the Prime Minister of the Kurdistan region, Mansour Barzani, canceled planned meetings with Iranian officials in Davos. Iraq also recalled its ambassador to Iran for consultations regarding the attack. So Iraq, I should say, has also faced several rounds of American airstrikes since mid-October when Shia militias began targeting U.S. occupation bases in Iraq and Syria over Biden's support for the mass slaughter in Gaza. The Prime Minister of Iraq, al-Sudani, has strongly condemned the U.S. strikes, and he says he wants to end the U.S. military presence in Iraq. The U.S. has also launched airstrikes in Syria and Yemen, just adding to this great risk we have of a massive regional war. Okay, and then this last story is from Dave again. Pakistan launches retaliatory airstrikes in Iran targeting militant groups. So this is from today, from the 18th. Pakistan said Thursday that it carried out airstrikes targeting militants in Iran, which came after an Iranian attack on Pakistani soil. So Pakistani officials say that the strikes targeted 7 locations used by the ethnic Baluch militant groups known as the Baluchistan Liberation Army and the Baluchistan Liberation Front. Pakistani warplanes and drones hit targets about 30 miles inside Iran in the Sistan and Baluchistan province. Iran condemned the strikes and said the attack killed 9 foreign nationals, 3 women, 4 children, and 2 men. So the Iranian Foreign Ministry said that, quote, it condemns the unbalanced and unacceptable actions of Pakistan in the drone attack on non-Iranian citizens in a village on the border wall of the two countries. Earlier in the week, Iran launched unprecedented missile strikes in Pakistan against Jaish al-Adl, the Sunni Muslim militant group, which took credit for that attack on the police station on the 15th of December, which I mentioned earlier. Now, nuclear-armed Pakistan strongly condemned those strikes because, as I said earlier, they killed 2 children. Both sides are calling on each other to do more to deal with these militant groups that operate along the shared border. The Iranian Foreign Ministry said they expect the friendly and brotherly government of Pakistan to adhere to its commitments in preventing the establishment of bases and armed terrorist groups in Pakistan. So we'll have to see if this escalates any further or if this is just the end of it for this time being. I've got some interesting comments from Trita Parsi, one of my favorite Iran experts, both of ours, who said last night, I'm stunned by the absolute idiocy of Tehran striking Pakistan. Tehran has bombed targets in 3 countries, none of which had anything to do with the Kerman terror attack. And this is the attack on the mourners who were honoring General Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Axis of, well, really the key figurehead of the Axis of Resistance against the U.S. and Israel and Saudi Arabia and their Al-Qaeda proxies in the region. But also the head of the Iranian Quds Force, who was killed in Baghdad on the way to a sort of a peace mission with the early stages of brokering peace and normalization between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And so he says Tehran bombed targets in 3 countries, none of which had anything to do with that Kerman terror attack. The building in Syria was empty. There was no evidence that has been provided that Mossad was in the Erbil building. And the Al-Qaeda offshoot in Pakistan was not involved in the Kerman attack by Iran's own admission. Pakistan is a nuclear power. It's obviously not going to tolerate being bombed. It has now retaliated and struck Iran. Hopefully that's the end of it. Seems Tehran suffers from the same do-something syndrome that so often causes Washington to shoot itself in the foot and make matters worse. We're all certainly familiar with that. So I'll have to stay posted on all this and see if anything spirals further between Pakistan and Iran or if things calm down. Of course, the issue remains that Israel continues to provoke Iran and all of its allies and partners in the region, as well as, and then the U.S. goes and cleans up all these, cleans up is not the right word, makes everything worse. But certainly the wars expand as a result of Israel going around illegally assassinating, carrying out terrorist attacks and sabotage attacks against Iran's, civilian nuclear program, which is a crazy thing to do. It's just taken for granted in the mainstream media, but you can imagine the environmental catastrophes that are possible from these bombings of nuclear facilities. We may start to see those step up here again in the midst of this current war with Gaza and also the Houthis and Hezbollah. And these assassinations that are just going on completely unchecked. I mean, the American government has essentially written a blank check for the Israeli government to go around murdering whoever they want. And then the Americans have to, because of the tacit backing of every single one of these killings, we end up facing consequences for Israel's actions because everything they do, at least on some level, is bylined by the American administration. And so we're just... as usual, it's just bad news for the foreseeable, but I don't know. We'll have to see. I hope cooler heads prevail right now because things can get out of control here very quickly.
All right, Connor, thank you for coming back on the show and giving us those updates. And we'll be back with more shows next week. Thanks, Connor.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kyle. Thank you, everybody.